There's a quote that I love. It's often attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. However, most, Islamic scholars say he never said it. It's not in the Quran. And so it kind of just gets, pawned off on anonymous. But he said, "Don't tell me how educated you are. Tell me how much you've traveled." There are many stereotypes that I'm constantly fighting, not just from people back home, but even people here. I meet them on airplanes and trains, and I tell them what I do and where I live, and they proceed to give me a lot of shit. It's everything from like, oh, you're unmotivated or lazy, not wanting any responsibility in life. You're chasing girls. You're chasing a phantom business deal that will never come. Or that you're running away from something back home. Maybe you are a criminal that can't go home. Maybe you can't make it at home, so you come to another country. All this BS out there that you're constantly fighting. A lot of people also think that you're not learning anything while you're here. You're just treading water. I have gotten this comment a few times, or variations of this comment over the years. Oh, I'd love to go to Asia and fart around for a few years. All right, so when are you coming back to America and getting a real job? Aren't you worried that spending so many years abroad is affecting your job prospects for when you come home? Are you kidding me? I think moving abroad has been the best thing I have ever done. The life skills that I have learned by moving abroad, I'm not saying you can't learn these skills back home, but I can learn them faster, harder, and they'd be more entrenched in my life, just for the mere fact of living in a different country. I've met a lot of other people with these rose-colored glasses about life as an expat. They see it on YouTube. People living in Bali or in Thailand, living on a beach and working online on a computer, and that's not always the case. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of life skills in order to do these things. Because you'll quickly discover, no matter what country you go to, even back home, the world is a very mean place, and it'll kill you if you let it. So I decided to sit down and take stock of some of the skills that I've actually been accumulating here. You learn these lessons very quickly, but you don't realize it until you actually sit down and write them down. Let's start with the obvious one, which is communication, learning language. You can work on trying to be fluent in the local culture's language, but as I have learned, that's really hard to do. You learn survival language. For example, when I was in the Philippines, I was speaking Chinese to some people in order to communicate. When I was in Zhuhai, which is the next city just south of here, I ran into a girl at a bar, pretty girl, and I wanted to talk to her, but she didn't speak English, and my Chinese at the moment was not very good. But she was learning Spanish, so I used some of my Spanish in order to talk to her in a bar in China. So you never know when and where these language skills that you pick up, even minor little skills, will be beneficial to you. Tú es muy bonita. That's more than just regular language. It's also gestures, body language. You don't say, hey, come here like this. That's rude. You got to say, hey, come here like this. This means something different in other countries. Facial expressions, hand signals, using all of these in cooperation with your broken language skills to help you communicate. It's also learning to scale your language, understanding that, okay, even if you're in a place where people speak your native language, you can't speak to them as if they were a native. You have to slow it down. You have to omit certain vocabulary that they're not going to understand. As native speakers, we often speak very idiomatically, and you can't speak idiomatically in other cultures. You have to speak very plainly. And that goes with learning these other languages too. When you learn common idioms from other cultures, you learn more about that culture and the etymology of those idioms. Probably the best skill that I have learned, and what anyone will learn when you go overseas, is critical thinking skills, specifically adaptability. The comfortability I've learned in all the traveling I've done, I can go to any country, anywhere in the world, and be able to take care of myself. I have that confidence in it because I feel as though I'm very adaptable, that I can adapt to almost any situation presented to me. I've developed a lot of flexibility, An hour here, an hour delay, an extra bit of paperwork here, no problem. Girl is late to dinner, no problem. I don't have that on the menu. Don't worry, I'll try something else. Another one is problem solving. I have become an expert in putting square pegs in round holes. Another one is resourcefulness. I know a guy. I heard at a poker game that someone's wife is able to get that done. So many different resources, guanxi as they call it. And of course that also includes things like networking. The community of expats in any country is small. It is pretty tight. Networking skills, shoot through the roof. Tolerance of change and uncertainty. It's common for things to be done at the last minute, or plans to not be finalized until the last minute. Having that kind of patience kind of goes a long way. Let's not forget also positive thinking. Even just politeness, customs and courtesies from around the world. The smile is the most effective diplomatic tool you have. Also just general friendliness, which in my opinion is kind of a lost art form. Next is cooperation and team working. When you live and work in a collectivist society, you have to work with other people. There's no such thing as doing things and accomplishing things on your own. Another big thing that I have learned is humor. What is funny to me might not be funny to another culture, and what is funny in that culture might not be funny to me. Developing your sense of humor, and of course that doesn't mean that you yourself are funny. That means that you understand what is and what is not funny. There's also respectfulness and respectability, not just for other people, other things, other cultures, languages, the way people do things, but also for yourself. You learn how to accept feedback and criticism and apply those criticisms so that you can improve your performance or whatever it is that you need improvement on. Being humble. Also, diversity awareness. Of course, coming from America, I'm no stranger to diversity. When I'm in America, I'm just another Joe Schmo. But when I'm in another country, especially where I live now, I am an extreme minority. So I'm much more aware of the diversity around me, but from a minority standpoint. It really flips the paradigm in your mind about your place in society and your place in the world. So as a result of this, one of the most important skills that I have learned and continue to learn is empathy. Being able to walk in somebody else's shoes. I learn of the plights and the motivations and the hardships and the triumphs of the people that I meet. You really learn of and you see the struggles of the everyday person. And honestly, you don't know what you don't know until you know it. You might agree with me that empathy is probably a skill best learned the hard way. It goes without saying, multicultural awareness is another skill that you develop when you're overseas. But it's not just the culture of the country that you're living in, but it's also the other expats from all around the world. My social skills, my personal social skills have improved greatly. I can very easily make friends anywhere I go. Next is money management. I'm not just talking about typical budgeting and paying your bills, but I'm also talking about international finance, investments, currencies, currency exchanges, foreign banks, taxes, emergency and contingency funds. I feel as though I've learned more about the power of money in my time abroad than I ever did back home. You also learn time management. And it's not just your daily schedule, the time difference between here and home. It's literally on the other side of the earth. So when I'm asleep, they're awake. And when they're awake, I'm asleep. Trying to manage that time properly so that you can deal with problems, you can deal with issues back home. There's also the ever elusive work-life balance. I have a much better understanding of work-life balance than I ever did back home, where it seemed like I was always working. Forgive me, I took a few days between filming this because I have a cold, so my voice is a little... I have my deep, sexy voice today. Another skill that you tend to learn very quickly is negotiation. Business negotiations, contract negotiations, sales negotiations. Everything is a negotiation when you're overseas. Your whole life is a negotiation. And one of the best things that you learn to do really well when you're overseas is storytelling. I remember watching, this commercial for the U.S. Navy many, many years ago, and it started with, if someone were to write a book about your life, would anyone want to read it? Well, if you've got all these experiences overseas, you're going to have stories to tell that very few people have. I tell all my students, if you can tell a story well, you're going to be successful in life. Another skill that you learn very, very quickly, because you almost have to, is leadership skills. So I've studied this, and I know it all very well. Leadership theory is one of the things that not only interests me, but I also teach it.
With leadership theory also comes motivation theory, because if you can figure out someone's motivations in life, then you can lead them. Discovering someone's intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Generally, intrinsic motivations are more powerful, but it's usually a mix of the two. You also have things like push leadership theory and pull leadership theory, whereas pull leadership would be like, hey guys, come with me, let's go this way. Whereas push leadership would be like, hey, you guys, go that way, do a good job. And there's good and bad on both theories, but I tend to think that push leadership theory is more effective, especially with today's millennial generation. One thing that is not taught in leadership classes, and a skill that you learn very quickly, is not necessarily leadership, but followership. If you are a mid-level manager, you're a CEO, or you're president of the United States, you should have good followership skills, because no matter where you are in life, we are all bootmakers to kings, meaning we all have a boss. I know many business owners would say, no, I'm the boss, the buck stops with me. Well, yeah, well, what about your customers? Your customers ultimately are your boss. Having that mentality, having that understanding in your head will develop your followership skills, because we all need that. I have been doing yoga for over 10 years. I recall when I first started, I was very overweight. I was smoking a lot of cigarettes. I was drinking a lot. And I was just stressed. I was always sick, and I had a very stressful job at the time. I was working in real estate. A friend of mine turned me on to yoga, and it completely changed my life. Not just the physical aspects of the meditation, the mental part of it, looking inward. Your whole life, your mind is telling your body what to do. Well, in a yoga session, that is your body's opportunity to tell your mind, hey, this is how I'm doing. So yoga was very good, not just for mind-body connection, but also for learning patience, learning to sit still and be quiet for however long you need to, and being okay with stillness. Nothing is going to go your way 100% all the time. So you have to learn to be patient. You really have to learn to go with the flow. Next is chain management. Chain management is basically relationship management. What I do here will affect someone else there, which will affect the outcome of this situation. Understanding those connections and managing the chain of events that occur based on your own decisions is something you really learn very quickly. Relationship management, and I'm not talking about relationships between boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives. And if you build a park in this part of the city, how will that affect the housing prices in and around that park? Which will in turn, how will that affect the demographics of the people moving into those apartments? And then in effect, how will that determine school enrollment in the local kindergarten? It's like playing chess. And you really get to see very quickly how one thing affects another, which affects another, which affects another.
Another thing, and there's something going on here in China that's a really good exercise in this, is change management. Not chain, but change management. And change management theory is a whole other discipline. There are consultants in the world that make a very, very good living consulting on change management. For example, if you've got a large organization that is going through a large change, how do you manage that properly without losing productivity, without losing money, without losing your mind, really? In Hong Kong, there's all these protests going on, and everyone knows. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but what that is a prime example of change management. Hong Kong is going through a very, very large change over the next couple decades. How do you do that? Do you do it incrementally, or do you do it stop, change, start? Do you wake up one day and all the berries are done and Hong Kong's just another Chinese city? Or do you change it gradually over time? So everything that's going on there will eventually become a very good case study for change management. Another thing that you're going to learn is living standard acceptance. I don't care where you go to, you have a certain way of living in your home country, and that's what you are accustomed to. Whether it be good or bad, doesn't matter. It's what you are accustomed to. And when you go to a different place, things are different, and you learn to accept it, and in many cases embrace the differences. One of the biggest differences I've had to learn is the squat toilets. As Westerners, we're used to sit-down toilets, and now we have squat toilets. And because I've never used them for most of my life, I don't have the muscle strength in my legs to squat for that long. Now, I prefer to use them because they are better and they're actually more hygienic. My freshman year of college, I drove a super shuttle, which is one of those airport shared ride shuttles, and I did that in Los Angeles. And what I learned driving around the LA freeways is assertiveness. You have to have the same assertiveness overseas, not just in driving, but in general. You remain polite when you're doing it, but you have to, just like when you're driving here in China, you gotta stick your nose in and say, hey, look, I'm here and you're gonna have to deal with me one way or another. Because if you don't do it, people are just going to come right in front of you and you're never going to get anything done. Another thing that you learn is business trends awareness. Certain industries back home that are matured and people are making a lot of money, have established brands, and then you see emerging economies that have the same industries but they're not quite as matured. They're still in their infancy stages. You look at that and you say, wow, what an opportunity for business, what an opportunity for investment. And you see it very, very plainly, very clearly. Example, here in China, coffee culture is exploding, but the market is still in its infancy. Camping is another big thing that's going to be huge in China. And pet culture, pet care and dog parks and veterinarians, it's a growing industry and it's still in its infancy here. Believe it or not, even Japanese toilets. When you go to Vietnam, they have the bum squirters there. They don't have those in China. But you can go and you can buy a Japanese toilet, one of those electric ones, and bring it to China and sell it for 4x what you paid for it. They're that popular, and there's not enough of them here for the market. Probably the hardest thing with being an expat abroad, and that's emotional management. Dealing with certain stresses in life, deaths in the family, being away from your family when there's a marriage or a birth in them. Dealing with emotions, good and bad, is something you have to learn. If you cannot develop that skill and manage it properly, it will kill you. If you've ever been to a Chinese government office, it's papers everywhere, and it can be overwhelming. Every country you go to has bureaucracy. You're gonna have paperwork, your hurdles to jump over, and fill out this form, fill out that form, in triplicate. Understanding how governments work and the bureaucracy involved in it, not only just for visas and work permits and things like this, but also just general life, getting a driver's license, paying your taxes. If you learn how to manage that bureaucracy in one country or two countries or three countries, pretty soon you start to realize that many countries are very similar. The more you do it, the more you're exposed to it, the more experience you have, it becomes manageable and in many ways not that big a deal. It just becomes part of life. You also learn situational awareness. I'm not just talking about walking down the street for safety. I'm talking about, okay, if you're in an area that might be a little sketchy, how do you navigate through this area? How do you treat the people? You learn how to have a work ethic, how to be a multitasker, because oftentimes you need to do two things at once. You learn self-reliance and self-motivation. How much can you take? How much the hits keep coming? You keep taking it and you just keep moving forward. You don't give up. You learn about hygiene consciousness. In America, you just drink from the tap, but you can't do that overseas. You have to be very, very cautious and very aware of where your drinking water is coming from, where your food is being cooked, who's preparing your food, where the food is grown. Food safety, unfortunately, is still an issue. Confidence, your self-confidence, being able to look at yourself in the mirror and saying a stronger, better prepared person for whatever challenges that meet you in the future. Even me, when I was back home, I was very closed-minded to the world, even though I thought I was open-minded. And in many ways, I'm still kind of closed-minded. Understanding that has allowed me to really work on that as a person and try to be more open-minded about cultures, about ways of thinking, about strange foods and different religious practices and different political thinkings. And being open-minded and being able to take in all of this stuff is a skill that you really develop quickly when you're overseas. It really does shift your perspective in many, many ways, for the better, I think. It elevates your own intellect and your own standing in the world. And lastly, another big important one is your independence. You really learn to take care of yourself and look out for yourself, and you embrace it. There's definitely a freedom that I feel in it. In a sense, I feel more free overseas than I did back home. Getting on a plane and coming to another country for the first time and not knowing anybody there will only strengthen that trait of independence. Well, that's the list that I've been able to come up with, and I haven't even scratched the surface. I honestly think there's a hell of a lot more that you learn that I didn't even think of. I mean, I didn't even go into anything about technology. So if you've got any other things that I've missed or any ideas or any comments, go ahead and put them below. Let's have a discussion about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I admit I'm not an expert on these things. I don't pretend to be. I just put my thoughts out there for the world to listen and the world to comment. But I do know this truth, and that is continuous improvement will always bring you closer to infinity. Yeah. Go put that in your pipe and smoke it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everyone.